So the next thing is the default yum repo is pointing to a older version of the Kubernetes. So I'm going to add a Kubernetes repository to point to the latest version for CentOS 7. So I told you there is a directory called etc yum.repos.d. There, if I put that, so if my yum will automatically go to the directory and then get that URL, right? So I'm just going to add an entry there. So let me create a file called etc yum.repos.d and let me create a new repository called Kubernetes repo. So I'm creating a new file called kubernetes.repo there. Inside that, I'm going to provide the repository URL for my Kubernetes packages. So this is the repository details. So basically, where the name is Kubernetes and the base URL is, this is the base URL from where it has to do it, and it has to, it should be in enabled state, and it should check the signature of the application, and this is the key. It should use it for the signature verification. Okay. So once the repo is added, let me install the Kubeadm and Docker. I'm having the older version of Kubelet, which is causing the Kubelet and kubectl. Let me do anything. Kubelet and kubectl. So Docker is already installed, so you don't need to worry about that. Good. So next thing is, I want the kubelet service to be running on the machine, because in Kubeadm method, because if you remember that in the previous method, kubelet was running only on my node machine. Okay, but in the Kubeadm method, all your server components, that is Kubernetes cluster components, are going to run as a Docker. So you need kubelet to communicate to that, so that you need kubelet on the master also. So let me start the Docker and the kubelet service. So command is systemctl start Docker, that's 100%, systemctl build Docker. So run this command. As my Docker is already started and enabled, it should be good here. And the next thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to enable the kubelet. Systemctl start systemctl enable kubelet. So Docker is to run the containers and kubelet is to communicate to the master, which is going to come up. So let me start the kubelet and the Docker in the master. So the next step we are going to do is, we are going to initialize the cluster using Kubeadm. So the command is Kubeadm. Using Kubeadm, I'm going to initialize the cluster. Okay. And I told you in Kubeadm method, all the components like API server, etcd, these are going to run as a containers, right? So I want kubelet to communicate to the Kubernetes API server, because the master is also going to act like a client here or the node here. So that's why I'm installing and enabling kubelet. Okay. So using the Kubeadm, let me initialize the cluster. So the command is Kubeadm init. Remove the BTCD. Clean up the etcd directory, and then run the Kubeadm init. So it is going to connect to the internet and download all the images for my API server etcd, and all those images it is downloading first. Kubeadm is a utility to bring up the Kubernetes cluster.
Sure.
Okay. So let me show you the Kubeadm init has been successful. If it is successful, you will get an output like this. So if you got this, just copy paste it on a specific location, because this is going to have the instructions to work with the cluster. So the first thing is to connect to the Kubernetes cluster, you need a configuration file. Okay. How to get that, copy that, and all those things. And then if I want to add a node to the cluster, this is the command I should add, use to add a node to the cluster. So just copy paste this. I will just explain what is happening. So just copy paste this, this complete line on a notepad. So we will use that in further labs. So if you see that this machine, I don't have any Docker images available. If you issue the Docker images command, you can see it has downloaded an API server, manager, scheduler, proxy, etcd, and core DNS and pass. So these are all the images my Kubeadm automatically downloaded it. Okay. And if you do a Docker PS, you can see the containers will be running. So there is a kube proxy running, there is a control manager running, there is a scheduler running. So the etcd is running, API server is running, right? So I have the containers running, and for every container, there will be a pass container that will be created. Okay. So that is something, this pass container is a concept of init containers. So this will, once the container is up, this will do the activities inside that. So this kind of a sidecar, which is getting injected. So you can see all the services which I manually configured is now available as a container. Kube proxy, control manager, scheduler, etcd, API server. Okay. So I don't need to manually provide any configuration files. I don't need to install any package or nothing. All these are available as a containers, and it is executing the containers. So I just wanted to show you that images and containers which the Kubeadm is going to bring it up. Okay. Now to connect to a cluster, okay, so I need to have an authentication enabled. Okay, how do I connect to the cluster, right? So for that, when Kubeadm is initializing, okay, it is going to generate a configuration file. So this is where I asked you to copy paste the output of the command. So if you see that it's saying to start using the cluster, you need to run the following as a regular user, so that as the user, you will be able to execute some of the commands. Okay. So basically, this is the configuration file I will be using to connect to the cluster. So let me see the content of the file. So in the manual method, we haven't enabled any certificate authentication or anything, right? But Kubeadm will bring up the cluster with the certificate. So if you read the config file, so it is going to have what is the IP and the port number where the API server is listening. Okay. What is the certificate associated with that? Okay. And what is the user I'm going to use to connect to the cluster? So all these things are automatically generated for you. Okay. So normally we were using a command yesterday, you remember, kubectl. When you want to connect to the cluster, you have to connect it using the kubectl. Okay, kubectl is a shorter form of kube control. Okay, and in the if you're work with OpenShift, you will call it as a OC client, which is something similar to the kubectl command. Okay, so to connect to the cluster, okay, kubectl will be looking for this authentication information on the user's home directory in a folder called .cube, and the file name should be config. So that is what this step is doing. So saying, and the user's home directory, create a directory called .cube. There, copy this admin.conf file in the name config and change the ownership of the file. So basically, whenever I want to run a kubectl command, right, I should be having this config file in the respective user's home directory with the folder name as .cube, and inside that the file name should be config. So let us run this command. So let me do it as a root user itself. I'm in the master. So let me run this command, mkdir. And then let me copy the config file to the .cube directory with the file name config. And then let me change the ownership of the file. So once I do this, if I do a kubectl get nodes, I can see the master is added to the cluster and it is in a not ready state. So kubectl is the client to communicate to the Kubernetes cluster, right? To make that work, I need the authentication information, okay? And normally that will be stored under the user's home directory, and the folder name should be and the file name should be config. That's what I have copied it. And when I run the kubectl get nodes, I'm seeing one server is added to the cluster, and that is in the not ready state. Reason behind it is I haven't configured any network providers here. Okay. Once I provide the network provider, this server will become into the ready state, because when you by default initialize the Kubeadm cluster, only kube proxy is available. I am not configuring any of the network providers. So here we will use the Weave network for that purpose. So this is Weave networks. So Weave is one of the extensively used network, and the installation is very, very simple in Weave. There is a YAML file available, so I can just download the YAML file and I can use it. Apply the network using the command. Okay, so in Kubernetes, whenever you want to give any instructions to the Kubernetes API, you need to provide them in a YAML format. Okay, for the Weave network, okay, we are already having the deployment YAML is available over internet. I'm just going to apply that. So to apply a file onto the Kubernetes cluster, the command is kubectl apply -f, and then I need to provide the file location. So in this command, you can see kubectl apply-f, there it is going to download the YAML file from the internet, that is cloud.view.work, and based on the kubectl version I'm using, okay, based on the kubectl version, it is going to select the View deployment YAML and it is going to apply that. Okay, so let me run this. So it is going to create multiple resources in my Kubernetes cluster. Okay, we will talk about them in detail when we bring up our cloud-based cluster. So it is going to bring up a service account. Through the service account only, it is going to communicate to the cluster. Okay, and it is going to create a role-based access control policy, and then it is going to assign the user to the role-based access control policy. Okay, and then it is going to create a daemon set. I will talk in detail about what is a daemon set. Okay, daemon set is one kind of a resource in Kubernetes, and I will talk about that daemon set in detail when we bring up our dashboard. And now if you run the kubectl get nodes, you can see the server come into the ready state. This is going to go to the cloud.vwork.com, and it is the network implementation instructions were written there. So it is basically a YAML file. Okay, so adding to that, let me also give you some more commands. kubectl get namespace. Okay, so either I can type namespace. So basically, when you install a Kubernetes cluster, it is going to create 4 default namespaces. So let me just give you the highlights about the default namespaces which are getting created. Okay, so the first namespace is called as I talked about namespaces, right? In the cluster, it's good to have it's a logical segregation of the resources running inside the Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so there will be a default namespace that will be created whenever you are running a command. Okay, it is going to apply this on the default namespace. Okay, and if you want a command to run on a particular namespace, you need to provide the namespace on the command. Like for example, so in this cluster, if I try to run the kubectl get pods, so get pods is the command to list all the containers running on the cluster, right? So if I run it, it is saying that there is no resource found in default namespace because this namespace I just now brought up, there is no resources running on it. Okay. But if I just give -n and then if I look for the kube system, I can see some of the pods are running. So kube system is the namespace where all the system related containers will be running, because when I bring up a Kubernetes cluster with Kubeadm, it is going to bring all the system related components as a pod, and these pods will be running in the kube system namespace. Okay, so if you see that it is having my API server, control manager, proxy, scheduler, and also core DNS. So Kubernetes by default comes up with a DNS service, okay? Because when you want to communicate within the cluster, okay, so you will not be able to get the IP address, and IP address is not reliable, right? When I define a service in Kubernetes, so I will not, when I do a deployment, the IP address of the container may change. I don't need to manage it with the IP address. So Kubernetes comes up with a default DNS system, and it will, for every service, it will provide a DNS name, and you will be able to communicate that. And whenever there is a deployment happening, if there is a change in the IP address, it will automatically go ahead and update the internal DNS system. Okay, that is what this core DNS service is all about. And my Weave network is running. So these are all the default system level pods are running, and that will be running under the namespace called kube system. Okay, so default namespace and the kube system namespace, and there is two more namespaces called kube public. So normally this will be used to implement your ingress controller and other things are there. Okay, and kube node lease. So some kind of a new namespace which is coming in. Let's check that. Okay, I think it is some enhancement which they are going to bring in to get the node heartbeat they are having using this namespace. Okay, this is basically for third-party monitoring plugins. They can get information about the node. Okay, this is some enhancement proposal which is coming in. It's okay. So these are all the 4 namespaces which by default comes in. Okay. So the default, when you don't specify in your namespace, so that will be deployed default namespace. And if you have any, okay. So these are all the 4 namespaces. Let me repeat. Default is used as the default namespace. Kube system, all the system related namespace will be, system related components will be running in the kube node namespace. And node lease will be used by, used for monitoring purpose. Okay, to get the information about the nodes information and other things. And kube public is used for public resources of the cluster. So these are all the 4 namespaces. If you want to execute any command, if you don't give any namespace, that is going to get executed on the default namespace. And if you specify the namespace using the -n tag, okay, you will use it. Okay, so let me quickly share you a So I'm going to do these things on node. The node I'm going to configure it to connect to the master. Sudo su and yum remove panel cube star. Let me remove the flannel and the cube star in the node. And next is I'm going to remove the disable SC Linux using the same set command, and then let me restart the machine. So in the node, I'm removing the previous installations, and then I'm going to provide the disable the SC Linux, and then I'm restarting the server. And once I get the login prompt, let me do login, then Q, then give SC S. So it should be in the disabled mode. Let me do the similar thing. Let me create a repo. So, right? etc repos.d is dot repo there. Let me print the content. So if you have an existing file, just overwrite the content, remove the existing content and overwrite it. Same content. So once it is done, I'm just going to use the same installation command. So install -y Kubeadm and Docker. So once it is done, let me start and enable the kubelet. So systemctl Docker. Kubelet start enable kubelet. So once it is done, if you go back to the notepad where we have seen, okay, there it might have provided a Kubeadm join command. So basically, this machine, I want to connect it to the master, right? So Kubeadm also provides you a join command, and when the master is created, there will be a token created. Only with this token, you will be able to connect to the master. So this is the command. So you can just copy paste the Kubeadm join command which you got it while bringing up the cluster. So you can save it in a common place. Okay. So using this join command, you will be able to join it to the master. Okay, I may get a error like that. If you get an error like that, what you have to do is, so basically in the IP table, I should be having this value as 1. So echo 1. If you get this error, so not all the missions you will get this error. If you get this error, just in the file, just put it as 1. Only if you get this error. So basically, the file should have a value as 1. And then run the Kubeadm join command. So now this should work. And if you go back to your master and give the kubectl get nodes, you can see it is up. It should be in ready state very soon. Yeah, now it is in the ready state. So it take around 20 seconds to join the node to the cluster. So this is how you can join to the existing cluster. Any mission, you can just bring it up and then install Kubeadm and Docker in it. And then using the join command, you'll be able to join the mission to the cluster.